So, everyone, inshallah, we'll start in about 2 minutes at 5. So we'll just wait for people to join, inshallah. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya al-mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for joining this live session with us at Cambridge Muslim College. Many of you probably know who we are. Some of you might be tuning in for the first time. We are an independent higher education institute and a registered charity. We run based on the generous donations of many of our friends, of our patrons, of people who have passed through the college during their visits to Cambridge. And we are trying to train a future generation of scholars, a future generation of thinkers, and we require the support of the community to do this. And so, inshallah, there should be a link on YouTube where if you are able to donate to the college and its mission, then we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward you for that and to make the ajr of that act, and for any good that is produced through CMC to make it heavy on your scale pans in the next life, inshallah. So my name is Dr. Salman Younas. I'm a lecturer at Cambridge Muslim College. And the session that I'm going to be discussing with you, it's kind of a very vague title, if I'm being honest, but it's about the spiritual dimensions of fasting and zakat in the Qur'an. And so there's a lot that we could unpack regarding the spiritual dimensions of fasting and of zakat or charity in the Qur'an. And one of the reasons why I decided to have fasting and charity in one single session or series of sessions is because oftentimes Ramadan is a time in which we increase our charity and in which many people also give their zakat. And so I thought it might be useful to give some comments, some lessons, some insights into how the Quran speaks about zakat as well. We'll start off with fasting, and then as we proceed through the weeks in this blessed Ramadan, we will get into a discussion on zakat more specifically. And so, alhamdulillah, we're all blessed to be in this month. We have made it. Many people have not been fortunate enough. We have seen people who have passed away. We have seen people who are unable to fast. And so we are blessed that we have reached this month. We have reached this month in good health. We are able to carry out the ibadat or the worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the opportunity to achieve. We have another chance at forgiveness, at purification, at rectification, at attaining God's pleasure. And for a lot of us, this is not our first Ramadan. And for other people who might be tuning in, this might be their first Ramadan. And so the first thing that we're usually taught when it comes to fasting, whether we're new Muslims or whether we are learning about Islam, the first thing that we learn about Islam, period, is usually this thing called the 5 pillars. And we know that fasting and zakat, which we'll discuss later, are from the 5 pillars of Islam. We know the Prophet ﷺ, he said in a very famous hadith that Islam was built on 5 things. Bunya al-Islamu ala khams. And one of the 5 things that he mentioned was fasting in the month of Ramadan. Before we actually get into some of the deeper discussions that I want to have, when we look at a hadith like this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and when we look at the usage of the word pillar in this particular hadith, then the image that they should conjure up in our minds is that this is a pillar, not just for the individual and not just for the righteousness of the individual and the next worldly felicity of the individual, but also a pillar for the collectivity of believers. And so when we look at the pillars of Islam, all the pillars of Islam, what we realize is that the pillars of Islam, they reflect both an individual vision, meaning a vision for the individual in terms of how the individual is meant to cultivate himself, how he is meant to spiritually grow, how he is meant to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it also expresses to us a particular social vision. And all the five pillars of Islam do this. Salah conveys the idea of ummah. Zakat conveys the idea of ummah. Fasting, and if you look at this particular hadith, the fasting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that the Prophet ﷺ, actually in the hadith that he mentions is fasting in the month of Ramadan. Because it is in the month of Ramadan that fasting really becomes this collective practice. Even though it is done by the individuals, it is a month in which the ummah comes together in solidarity to express their neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through this act of fasting, and along with it, the many other rituals such as taraweeh, praying in congregation, giving more abundant charity, and so on and so forth. The Hajj is a place where we all come together collectively to express our submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so there is a social vision in terms of the construction of ummah that all the five pillars of Islam are trying to attain or achieve. And when we look at the Quran, we know this idea of ummah is very important, right? We have du'as in the Quran where the believers are asked to state, رَبَّنَا وَجَعَلْنَا مُسْلِمِينَ لَكَ وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِنَا أُمَّةً مُسْلِمَةً لَكَ. That, oh Allah, make us Muslims, and from our progeny, make a community who submit to you. And similarly, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us an ummatan wasata, to make us a middle nation. And so this idea of ummah is very important. And fasting is one of those practices, particularly in the month of Ramadan, that is meant to cultivate that sense of ummah and is meant to produce a community of believers that direct themselves together to the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so each of the pillars of Islam, that when we look at them, whether it's salah, whether it's zakat, whether it's Sawm in the month of Ramadan, whether it's Hajj, whether it's zakat, all of them are ways of expressing submission, of expressing humility, of expressing need to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but each from a particular perspective, right? Some from the perspective of, or through the means of wealth, some of them through the means of our bodies, some of them through the means of our recognizing our neediness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through preventing what sustains us in terms of food and drink. And when we look at these pillars, it's good to try and look at them and see what is unique about this particular pillar or this particular action in terms of what is it trying to convey to me about myself, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and about my relationship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because prayer is an expression of submission, and fasting is an expression of submission, but they take on different forms, and these different forms that these practices take on gives us some insight into the nature of our submission. And when they come together, these pillars, then we get this complete picture of what submission actually is meant to look like, what humility towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually meant to look like. And it reveals something about us as human beings, and it reveals something about our knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world, right? We know He gave us a natural disposition. He gave us a soul. He gave us hearing. He gave us sight. He gave us a faculty by which we can reflect and we can think and we can look around us and within us and recognize the existence of a creator. And when we recognize the existence of a creator, someone who brought all of this into being, someone to whom we owe our very creation, every breath we take, our provisions, then there's nothing left to do but to submit to this Creator. And then after we submit to this Creator, then we express that submission in different ways, and fasting is one of those ways. And so in the lessons that we'll be having over the course of the next 4 weeks, what we really want to focus on is, what is the reality of fasting? What form of submission is fasting really trying to express? And how should we understand this act of not eating and not drinking and not engaging in sexual relations? Why do we perform these rituals? What exactly does the act of fasting tell me about myself as the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What does it exactly tell me about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And how does this ritual specifically, how does it allow me to know and connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala better? And so we turn to probably the most important Quranic verse when it comes to fasting, especially in the month of Ramadan. And surprisingly, unlike Salah and unlike Zakah, which appear dozens and dozens of times in the Quran, fasting actually does not appear that often in the Quran. There are only probably a dozen instances where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions fasting. And fasting in Ramadan specifically are mentioned only in a few verses. But the most important of these verses is the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to actually observe the fast, when He says, "O you who believe, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, kutiba alaykum as-siyam," that fasting has been prescribed for you, kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, just as it was prescribed for those who came before you, la'allakum tattaqun, so that you can attain taqwa. And so this verse is addressed to believers. It obligates them to fast. And by fasting, the word siyam, we mean to hold back, to do imsak from eating and from drinking and from sexual relations. And it tells us that this command is consistent with the command given to previous peoples, to past nations, who were also told to fast, and that the purpose of our fasting is to attain taqwa. We'll take the idea of taqwa and what it means and how fasting allows us to realize taqwa and how we should understand taqwa in this context in next week's lesson. But in today's lesson, I want to just focus on one aspect of this verse that I think doesn't always get as much attention, which is this idea of كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, just as fasting was prescribed for previous peoples. And the reason I want to focus on this particular portion of the ayah is because it reveals to us something about the Quran itself. It reveals to us something about the way in which the Quran communicates to human beings. And the way the Quran communicates to human beings is that oftentimes, if not always, the Quran is always forcing the human mind, always forcing human consciousness to direct itself in a myriad number of directions, in very evocative, powerful ways. It moves the gaze from one place to another, to another, to another, all in pursuit of the one, and all in pursuit of truth, and all in pursuit of unity. And so it exposes you to multiplicity, all in search for the one who is the creator, the arranger, the organizer of this multiplicity. And so the human mind is connected to the past. The human mind is given a window into the future. It is given a window into other realms, the realm of the jinn and the angels, of the next life. It is told to direct its gaze up to the heavens, to the stars and the sun and the moon, or down to earth, to the mountains, the animals, the trees, the soil, the water. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His book, which is His divine speech, is constantly almost bombarding the human mind with imagery of what is around it and what is beyond it, in order for the human mind to reflect on something deeper and something that lies beyond all of these things that are apparent to us. And so when we look at this verse, the Quran could have very easily have said simply, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, right? Fasting is prescribed for you, and it's been prescribed for you so you can have taqwa. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically mentions in this verse, كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, that this fasting that has been prescribed for you has also been prescribed for those who have come before you. And by mentioning these people who have come before us, the Quran is actually trying to remind us of something about ourselves and about the rituals we perform, right? That these are rituals and that we are a people who are connected to a very, very ancient, a sacred, a glorious history, a history of prophets, a history of believing communities, a history of peoples who were also sent wahi or divine guidance and divine revelation, and they were prescribed a way of living. And the Quran is God instructing us as a continuation of this way. We are not a completely cut off, separate, club, disconnected from what has come before us and what will come after us. Rather, the Quran is God's eternal speech that was a continuation of the interactions that he was having with the Israelites, the Banu Israel, where the monotheism that was taught and preached and revealed to the Israelites was now transferred beyond the realm of the Banu Israel. And the mantle of that Tawheed was now taken up by the Ummah of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. And so the Quran is a transferring of the message. It is a taking of that original Abrahamic call and a universalizing of that call. And so the way that we are following in our fasting is the way, as we will see, of Adam alayhi salam and of Noah and of Jesus and of Uzair and of Daniel and of all the prophets that have come before us. And this kind of makes sense when you think about the Quran. The Quran is the final message. And there's always this idea that the end of something, the culmination of something, tends to gather all of the meritorious aspects or the good of what has preceded it, right? And so the Quran, as a culmination, combines all of the messages in its own unique way of the prophets that have come in the past and of many of their practices. And similarly, we see with the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ is the seal of the prophets, and that is why the ulama mention that the Prophet ﷺ gathers all the perfections of the previous prophets. And so this takes us to fasting. And so when we think about fasting, it's very clear from the Quran, fasting is an ancient and a primordial practice, right? Abstaining from these essential things that sustain us, that give us life for spiritual purposes, was part of the fabric of many of the ancient cultures that we find in the Near Eastern context, that we find with the Jews and the Christians and various prophets. And so from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, we have references very clearly to some of the prophets who were fasting. We have references to the fast of Dawood ﷺ, that he would fast every other day, and the Prophet said this was the best of fasts. And we have narrations even from Sayyidina Nuh ﷺ, that he would fast his entire life except for the few days in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered that he not fast. But when you look at other scriptures, when you look at, for example, the Old Testament and the New Testament, you'll find that fasting goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. And Imam al-Suyuti in his Awa'il also mentions this point. The first error, we oftentimes kind of forget this point. The first mistake that is made in the Garden of Eden was a violation of a dietary restriction of sorts. It's consuming something that was not meant to be consumed. And in some of the intertestamental books, these books that come between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you'll find mention of the fact that Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, he engaged in a 40-day fast in order to repent from this slip that he had fallen into. Similarly, when we think of Uzair in the Old Testament, we find that there is clear mention that he ate no bread and he drank no water, for he was in mourning over the trespasses of those who had returned from exile. He was seeking the divine forgiveness through this act of fasting. He was seeking atonement for the wrongs of his community. We find that when there was calamities, or when there were human or natural disasters, when communities were threatened, that it was very common for the Banu Israel to observe fasts. They observed a Psalm when it came to their wars against Benjamin, when it came to their wars against the Transjordanian armies, when it came to them being potentially annihilated by the Babylonians and by the Persians. In all these cases, these individuals gathered together and they fasted, pleading to God to save them from these calamities that had struck them. We know that Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam fasted on the day of Ashura, and he did so out of shukr for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophet, when he went to Medina, he found the Jewish tribes over there fasting, and he asked them, "Why are you fasting?" And they explained to him that we are fasting because this was the day that Musa alayhi salam was saved from Fir'aun, and that Bani Israel was saved from Fir'aun. And so we do it out of thankfulness for that. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, "We are more worthy of Musa than you are." And that is how the day of Ashura was inaugurated as a day of fasting for the Muslim out of a sacred past that we had recalled. We know the Prophet fasted on Mondays and Thursdays as a reminder and as a form of thankfulness to God as his creator. We know there are very important instances in the Old Testament where fasting is actually a way that prophets prepared to receive revelation. And this is a very profound point, which again we'll get to next week. But preparation to receive this divine revelation was oftentimes done through the act of fasting. Daniel fasted for 21 days, and at the end of those 21 days, God gave him revelation. And Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, when you look at Exodus and other sources, when he went up to Mount Sinai and before receiving the Ten Commandments, he observed a fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And even when Sayyidina Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, after he was baptized and when he was just beginning his public ministry, he went out into the wilderness and he also did a 40-day fast. And so Elijah does a 40-day fast. Moses does a 40-day fast. Sayyidina Isa does a 40-day fast, all in preparation for some divine inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this will be important when we get into what fasting tells us about the human being. And so fasting, one of the things that really comes out from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, from the Old Testament and the New Testaments, is that fasting was being done for many different reasons, right? It was being done for penance. It was being done for forgiveness, the seeking of forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was being done to ready oneself in anticipation or in preparation to receive revelation, which is a very heavy thing. Not everyone can carry revelation. There's a state of inner purity that you have to achieve in order to be the carrier of revelation. It was done to avert calamity, to avert punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was done to thank God. And these actions, or this particular action of fasting, continued to be expressed in the Islamic tradition with some specific alterations that the Islamic faith or the Islamic tradition made in terms of number of days, in terms of lengths. These are details where our Islamic faith differs from the legislation that was given to prior prophets. But when you look at all the reasons that have been given for fasting, from the previous generations, previous prophets, up until our own prophet, upon them all be peace, what we see is they all come back to one thing, right? They all come back to the fact that all of our lives at every moment should return to the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this remembrance takes on various different forms. And one of those forms is the form of fasting. And that's why you find over and over again within the Old Testament and the New Testament and within the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, you find numerous reasons and moments where fasting is being done. And the fact that there are these myriad reasons points us to this reality that all of the moments of our life, no matter what situation we're in, we should be turning in some way or in some form to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when we look at some of these, reasons for fasting, some of them are actually quite important when it comes to understanding how fasting links to them and also understanding fasting in the Quran. So we mentioned this word penance, or seeking atonement for something that you have done wrong. And the very nature of fasting does this because the very fundamental act of fasting is in fact an expression of weakness. Imagine going outside, you see someone, he's hungry, he's thirsty, he's not able to satiate himself. This is a person that we see as a needy person, right? And he can do nothing but stretch out his hand and ask people for provision and for nourishment. And so the idea of lack of satiation being an expression of weakness and need, and being an expression also of a type of equalization between individuals, where in the month of Ramadan, all of us, it doesn't matter whether you're rich or whether you're poor, whether your fridge is full or whether it's empty, for this particular duration of time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala equalizes everyone and He subjects everyone, unless they have a specific excuse, to a realization of their weakness by making them go without food and without water for a particular duration of time. And so we appear before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as people in a state of hunger, people in a state of need, people in a state of almost abject poverty in one way, when compared to the ghina or the complete independence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's physical toil and there's physical difficulty involved in this. And all the pillars of Islam express this physical difficulty and physical toil in different ways. The Hajj, there's a reason why in the Hajj you don't put on perfume and you put on this very simple garment, because you're supposed to appear before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this state of utter humility, utter humbleness. And the fasting is also an expression of the same thing. You are appearing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like a child appears before its mother when it's hungry. And you have nothing, there's nothing you can do except stretch your hand out and recognize your own weakness. And this is what we mean by the fast teaching us something about ourselves, that going 10 hours without food and we are reduced to this utter state of weakness. And that tells us something about the human condition, which in turn tells us something about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one who is free of all needs. And so we appear before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this state of need, just like we appear before Him in Hajj in front of the Kaaba, just like we appear before Him in Salah, just like we appear before Him in various other contexts, in order for our sins to be forgiven. And what is interesting about fasting as a means of penance is that the majority of verses in the Quran that you find about Sawm, not Sawm in Ramadan, but Sawm generally, are Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribing fasting as a specific way of atoning for something that you have done that is wrong, or something you have done that requires some type of expiation. And so if you kill a believer mistakenly, this is mentioned in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands you to fast. One of the expiations for this, for killing a believer mistakenly, is to fast 2 continuous months. If you break your fast intentionally, in a specific manner, the expiation for that, the way you rid yourself, you atone for that sin, is you fast 2 months consecutively. When you're on Hajj and you're unable to trim your hair because, this is the final rite of the Hajj, to trim your hair. When you're unable to do that because of some, illness or some other excuse that prevents you, what do you do in atonement for that? You fast 3 days as or you just do a fast in order to atone for that. When you break an oath, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands you, فَصِيَامُ ثَلَاثَةِ أَيَّامٍ. You fast for 3 days in atonement for breaking that oath. So this idea of penance in Islam, it's really been codified within the law itself, that fasting is something that you do in order to make up for some slip or some inability to perform an action that is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another thing, and this will be maybe the final thing that I'll end on before I take your questions, is the link between fasting and revelation. This ayah that we took, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. A few verses later, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان فمن شهد منكم الشهر فليصمه. It was in the month of Ramadan that the Quran was revealed as guidance for mankind, clear messages giving guidance and distinguishing between right and wrong. So any of you who is present that month should fast. And so there is, of course, a very strong link between Sawm in Ramadan, fasting in Ramadan, and between the idea of revelation. We are seeing again over here something of this concept of reminders that is so prominent in the Quran. That this month of Ramadan is a month of revelation. It is a month in which guidance came down, a month in which the Quran came down, a month in which the world was given light after being in a long period of darkness. And to fast in Ramadan is to recognize a monumental moment in history that reminds us of Allah, His blessings in terms of guidance, first and foremost, and our purpose itself to be guided. And it connects us not only to the sacred past of people like Sayyidina Adam and Nuh and Sayyidina Musa and Sayyidina Isa, may Allah bless all of them, but also the sacred past of the Prophet ﷺ, who was in the cave of Hira, and that is when he received revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so we celebrate that idea. But the idea of revelation, being reminded that revelation descended in this month on a human being, it actually informs us about our state, or it tells us about something regarding the human state, which is that the human being, even though none of us can earn revelation, right? Revelation is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to people that He selects for revelation. But when we think about revelation and we think about the recipients of revelation, the prophets, then we think about the states that they imbibed, and we think about the potentiality that humans have within themselves to actualize and realize something, if not fully, but some aspect of these noble prophetic states. And fasting was a key to that. Over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding us by obliging us to fast in Ramadan. He is trying to connect our minds to revelation. And then when we look at the previous scriptures and we think, oh, Sayyidina Isa, he fasted before his public ministry. And Musa alayhi salam, he was said to have fasted 40 days before he received the 10 commandments, as mentioned in Exodus. And Elijah fasted alayhi salam before he received revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the same mountain as Sayyidina Musa did. And Daniel, he fasted before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him visions and revelations about the future of the Banu Israel. What we see is fasting is a means or a practice that is powerfully connected to the cleansing of your internal state, such that you can become a receptacle and a vessel of those divine effusions and those divine messages, that you're able to absorb them in a way that a person who has not suppressed his base desires is unable to do. And so it tells us something about the purity of the soul and fasting's link to purifying the self, such that we find all these prophets in these various scriptures fasting before they receive the most direct form of communication that you can receive from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is revelation. And so when we think about fasting and we read about this verse, we really need to think about ourselves, again, not as a club. We are not the Muslim club. We are an ummah that is connected to many ummah in the past, where there's a idea of sanad, where the Prophet ﷺ sees himself as the brother and the continuation of all of the prophets that came before him. And so we are part of a glorious sacred history. And when we fast, we are following in the footsteps of the Anbiya. We are following in the footsteps of our noble Prophet ﷺ. We are following in the footsteps of people who purify themselves through this action to be ready to receive the direct revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so fasting gave rise to a particular state, and that state is what the Quran goes on to mention, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, in order that you may have taqwa. And so in this lesson, I just wanted to mention this idea of sacred past and sacred history, and the myriad ways in which fasting was the reasons why it was done in the past and by whom it was done, and the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always directing the mind to the bigger picture, right? And so whenever we think, whenever we close our eyes, whenever we reflect on fasting, we should not simply think of it as, well, I'm just not eating and drinking. This is just 1 month. This is a few moments in my life that come and go. It should not just be hunger and thirst. One of the things that should come into our minds is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions over here, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِن قَبْلِكُم, right? That we are in the footsteps of these great, great prophets, these great righteous individuals. And just like they purified themselves completely, we too are on a journey of purification. And inshallah, next week we will look at what exactly taqwa means and what exactly this form of purification looks like. And so I will stop there in case anyone has questions or comments. But hopefully that was of some benefit to everyone. And like I said, these sessions that we will have, we'll try to make them as connected as possible. And so if some things don't make sense entirely, if there are questions raised about some of the things that we mentioned, some of them will be addressed in the future sessions that inshallah we'll be having. And of course, before I would encourage you all to pose questions if you have, and I'll just maybe wait 2 minutes to see if you do have any questions, and then we can take them for the next maybe 10, 15 or so minutes. So one of the questions that we have over here is about women who fasted. What about women who fasted historically? I am pregnant and looking for information. So one of the interesting things about the Old Testament is uh, they actually do mention, especially when it comes to spontaneous fasting. The Old Testament, you do find spontaneous fasting to be more common than kind of prearranged fasting. So Ramadan is what we call it's a collective set date of fasting, right? Every month Ramadan comes, we fast. Spontaneous fasting is what's happening in, some of these scriptures, these older scriptures, such as the Old Testament, where an army is coming, we all need to let's fast so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can avert this calamity for us. Oh, so and so has passed away. Let me fast in order to seek forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oh, such and such has happened. Let me fast in order to express my thankfulness for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The idea of thankfulness is, of course, really unique because the idea of thankfulness by abstaining from food and drink is a question that oftentimes comes in the minds of people. And we'll address that maybe at some later time. But when you look at the Old Testament, there are a lot of examples of these spontaneous fasts being done by women. But you also find within at least the Islamic legal tradition, like I said, this is an equalizing fasting. Like many other rituals of Islam, it's kind of an equalizing ritual, right? It puts everyone on the same plane. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran does make an exception for pregnant women who, not explicitly, but they fall within the definition of people who are marid, people who might suffer from an illness or who might not have the physical ability to fast. And so the ulama, there's a consensus pretty much of the ulama that pregnant women who are unable to fast are also exempt from fasting. And the rules of this can be found in the works of fiqh. And usually people are the best judges for this, right? People need to think about, if you're a pregnant woman, you are still required to fast if you believe that you can do so without harming yourself or without harming your child. The greater the sacrifice, the greater the toil, and the greater the difficulty, oftentimes relates to a greater reward, right? This is something that you find in the text of our tradition. They have these debates about what's better to do. Is it better to have longer prostrations in prayer, or is it better to have a longer qiyam or a longer standing position in prayer? The ulama mentioned it's better for you to have a longer or elongated standing position because it's tougher on you. And so there is this connection between ajr and between your ability to really get into things that are difficulty. And so for pregnant women, fasting is still prescribed for them, and they will have the reward for that. And they might have extra reward for that because it might be slightly more difficult. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is clear that people who are unable to physically do it, people who fear harm from it, then there's a dispensation for them that they should not or do not have to do it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explicitly reminds people, even in that state, that people who have been given exemptions for fasting, recall in your mind that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is someone who desires ease for you and does not desire difficulty for you. Another question that we have is, was the fasting of previous nations similar to ours? This is a good question. There's a lot of khilaf or difference of opinion between the ulama on when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, the same way it was prescribed for the nations before you. What type of similarity was this? Was this only a similarity in terms of they had to fast sometimes and we had to fast sometimes? Was this a similarity in the sense that they also have to fast a month and we have to fast a month? Was this a similarity in terms of they have to fast from dusk till dawn and we have to fast from dusk till dawn? So the scholars have a lot of disagreement on this. And what we generally tend to find is, no, previous nations, even though the act of fasting itself was prescribed for them, yet the duration, some ulama said, was different. The time period in which fasting was done was sometimes different. And so the idea of fasting the 3 days of the month, the 3 middle days of the month, some of the ulama mentioned this was actually the original way that the past nations used to fast, which was 3 days. And so there is a lot of debate about what exactly that form of fasting took, but we do know that they did fast, and we do know that the Islamic tradition continues that noble ritual. Did the Quraysh fast also, or was this completely alien to them? No, the Quraysh did fast as well. And this is one of the really fascinating things about looking at the past. One of the things that you see when you look at the past is, even in the Old Testament, some of the most evil people are fasting, right? It's almost like fasting was so core to the culture of the ancient East, and it was so central to this idea of being a form of atonement, being a form of seeking forgiveness from God, being this utter expression of need that you direct towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive you and to cast away calamity and misfortune from you, that you find even people who weren't necessarily believers engaging in this practice. And so the story of Jonah, you can read the story of Jonah, Salman Younas, where he approaches this king who's a very evil king, and he calls him to Islam, calls him to the submission of God. And this person who has a very, very bad record, he is not a good person. He eventually, in order to ward off the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, commands all of his people to fast, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to his act of fasting by averting the calamity from them. And so there is some question about that, which I won't get into the details of right now. Does fasting as a form of worship hold a higher priority in seeking atonement and spiritual growth compared to other acts of worship, such as salah and dua? What we can say, again, and this is why at the very beginning, the way I tried to frame this was every single pillar of Islam expresses atonement, expresses submission, expresses humility, expresses spiritual growth in a different way. And what we'll take in next week's class is each of them. Ultimately our purpose is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This is our purpose. We want to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as he truly deserves to be known, because it is only when you know someone as he is meant to be known can you submit to that person as he is meant to be submitted. If you don't fully understand who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, if you don't really know him, and I don't mean in a mental way, I mean in a deeply spiritual way from the core of your soul, then your submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also be lacking. And each of the five pillars of Islam kind of hone in on particular names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? They remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when you think of fasting and you think of nourishment, you're reminded of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as He is the Musawwir, He is the Khaliq, He is the Razaq. These names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala become more embedded in your ruhani consciousness. And this is one of the purposes of these particular rituals. And so hopefully that like I said, we'll take that in more detail in the next class, insha'Allah. And remember, there are many other speakers and lecturers that we have at Cambridge Muslim College who are delivering these Ramadan reminders every day of the week around the same time as I have today at 5 p.m. And tomorrow we will have Dr. Ramon Harvey. He's going to be discussing the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. And then we have Dr. Rania Awad on Friday, Sheikh Suleiman Van El on Saturday, and Dr. Rothman on Sunday. And once again, I would like to ask everyone, do go to the CMC website, donate generously. We rely upon your generations. All these events that you're seeing happening are sustained by your generations and your charity. And inshallah, this will be a sadaqah jariyah, because every single student that we teach, every single lecture that we promote, every single piece of content that we put out there that teaches someone about Islam will be in your good deed, because you are the ones who are supporting this. And so I would encourage everyone, if you are able, to support this, to spread the word. And we need these types of institutions within the UK and elsewhere as well, to sustain Islam for the next generation. So Jazakumullah khairan for coming, and inshallah I will see everyone next week on Tuesday, 5 p.m. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.